There are two very popular visions about how AI wipes out humanity. The first one has to do with the accomplishment of getting to AGI, artificial general intelligence. So this is where AI gets to be as smart as us, eventually way smarter than us, and then it decides, okay, we don't need these humans around anymore, and off we go. That's one picture. The other picture is a bit, in some sense, more mundane. It's something like we take AI, we put it into our military systems, and before you know it, we're at all out war with every other country because the AI is going off on its own. Not necessarily rogue, but forcing us into decisions that we wouldn't want to make, or having to make decisions at the rate of automation, which is faster than we can actually comprehend and be responsible. And so this eventually leads to a war of all against all that's beyond human control because we put it in the hands of the AI and now we're all dead. Okay, let's put the AGI stuff to the side where we have these artificial super intelligences that get rid of the mere peons that are human beings. Put that stuff to the side. I think that's nonsense, but let's put that to the side for today. What I want to focus on is that second picture, the one in which, plausibly, or at least it seems on the face of it plausibly, we use AI in a variety of ways in a military context, and things just get out of hand. And that's a very bad place for things to get out of hand, especially when you're talking about international warfare. But then the question is, what's the actual probability? Now, I could concoct various scenarios in which things do go sideways, but there's possibility and then there's probability. And sure, it's possible, but I want to know, how probable are we talking about here? Are we talking about a 10% chance? That would be terrifying. Are we talking about 0.01%? Much less terrifying. Is it more or less probable than, say, climate change wiping everyone out? So I wanted to talk to someone who actually knows what they're talking about, who has, say, worked with the DoD, worked with military, and has insight into the way in which AI may or may not and does not get adopted by the military, and what has to happen in order for AI to be adopted in that kind of context. I spoke to Dr. Heather Roth. She received her PhD in political science, and she's currently a senior research scientist at the Center for Naval Analyses, which is an independent nonprofit that informs the decisions of the Navy, the Marine Corps, and DoD leaders. And before that, Heather was a senior research analyst for Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory and a research scientist for DeepMind. And finally, she was also appointed the special governmental expert for the Defense Innovation Board, where she produced the Defense Innovation Board's Artificial Intelligence Principles for the Department of Defense. Heather knows this stuff very well. She's worked with people at the DoD, and she has a much clearer picture than anyone I've ever talked to before about what actually goes on in a military context, especially at that senior level, and how AI gets incorporated into weapon systems, operations, and so on. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I think the basic takeaway is we can chill out. I think that's the sort of the big headline. We can chill out on the condition that, important condition, the other countries chill out as well. If it turns into a kind of massive competition about who can put more AI into their military forces than the other, then we might run into a problem. But that is not crazy probable. It's not particularly probable. In fact, Heather thinks it's less probable than, say, climate change wiping us out. So that's good. There's lots of detail, lots of really interesting insight into how the military thinks about technology generally, how it has been and will continue to integrate AI. And so I found the conversation really eye-opening because it's a conversation that allows us to not let our imaginations just run away into the wild and get really scared. So that's one of the things that I loved so much about this conversation with Heather. And then the last thing I loved about it, and this is a bonus at the end, we both go on these sort of mutual rants about why we hate the word impact and why we hate the word trust. Always love to find people who get worked up about the use of words and the misuse of words, and it annoys us. So that's a little bonus at the end. Okay, so that intro to the side, my name is Reed Blackman. I'm the host of Ethical Machines, and please follow the podcast, give it 5 stars, write a review, share it with your friends, do the things that you're supposed to do when you like these things. Okay, and also if you want to reach out to me, you want to tell me how much you love the show, or more importantly, you've got some suggestions, people you want me to talk to, issues you want me to address, please email me at em@reedblackman.com. Em, like ethical machines, at reedblackman.com. Okay, let's go talk about AI in the military and whether it's going to wipe us all out. All right, so Heather, it seems like I could probably accurately characterize you as justifiably agitated by virtue of the sloppy ways that people throw around the term AI, and particularly in a military context. So, is that a fair characterization? And if so, tell me more about why you're agitated or the nature of the sloppiness and what it leads to.
Yeah. I think you are correct in the justifiably agitated. I think the justifiable part is crucial. My agitation doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from a couple of different directions, right? So in the military context, number one, there has been so much use of computational technology of one variety or another for decades, right? And really
Sure.
going back to the end of World War II, right? So 70 odd years, we've been using some form of computational apparatus, let's just call it that, in military affairs, in weapon systems, in computer processing, things like that, right? And so there's one side of that house is this very long history. And then there's this kind of newness around the descriptions around AI, and then obviously the buzz around the term AI, and then the signaling that each country does to one another, right? So that you have claims from Putin, right? Whoever has AI is going to rule the world. And then you have all of the military modernization stuff that's happening, where you see so many military starting to engage in these modernization efforts around autonomy, around artificial intelligence, hypersonic weapons, things like this, right? So there's a signaling thing that goes on, which is different, right, than the actual technical side of the house. But when they signal, they're saying like how great we are at AI, look at our AI capabilities. That's one thing, and I understand that. But internally, it's really hard to then disaggregate and disassociate what's completely BS and what's actually technically feasible and what's technically hard and what's impossible. And so many people, DoD is a huge organization, right? The largest department, right? Federal department. It's got the biggest budget. It's got like 3 million people who work there. It's on every area of the globe. And aligning everybody's understanding of what everybody's talking about at any one given time is challenging.
Yeah.
But what's more challenging is that people just don't actually read stuff. So you have even senior leadership saying really silly things. And I'll say silly instead of asinine, but I really mean asinine when I say silly. And they say
And by
things.
asinine, you mean something else.
Exactly.
By asinine, you mean something more robust. Yeah.
Exactly. They'll say things that are just, they could be completely antithetical to actual existing DoD policy, number one, where you're like, that's not the official policy of the DoD. Or they say things that you just go, what are you talking about? That's not true. Or they say things that they shouldn't say generally. And generals saying things they shouldn't say generally is the problem in my world. But yeah, so you have all of these different, I would call them rivers, right, of wrongness going in one direction. And so what's happening then is my frustration comes out of like, look, what do you mean when you say AI, right? Because if you're talking about systems that are based on things like symbolic logic, that are much more deterministic, right, then that's a type of AI. And that's a type of AI that we've been using for longer than you and I have been alive, Reed, right? And those types of computational architectures are in existence like everywhere, right? All of the Space Force uses these kinds of architectures. Missile defense uses them. They're on weapon systems. They're on the Aegis system for battleships in the Navy, right? Like those types of software systems were at one time called artificial intelligence, right? Machine intelligence from the 60s all the way through the 90s. And they're still considered AI, right? It's just right now people are saying AI and they mean one particular thing, or they mean one particular technique, or they're even moving the goalpost further than that and thinking that it's something even more than that. And no one's
like
making
AGI or something,
like some sort of AGI. And even now the definitions around AGI are getting slippery. And so I feel like what's happening is that when somebody says AI, I'm like, well, what are you talking about? What do you mean? And then what's the widget that it's attached to, right? Like, there is the kind of notion of some sort of intelligence that is non-natural. Okay, fine. But like, what is it doing?
Yeah.
And so I think in the military domain, that what is it doing thing is super important to be able to say that's good, bad, indifferent, whatever.
Yeah. Part of me feels, tell me if I'm misreading this, but it feels like what you're saying is, look, there's all this talk about AI. It's all hyped up. Bottom line is that it's essentially the core stuff, at least maybe put generative AI to the side, I'm not sure, but much of AI is old news for the military or something that's sufficiently akin to contemporary narrow AI that we called the old stuff AI. So then I'm wondering if I should infer two things. One, should I infer that, does that mean that really we've got the policies already in place? Since the military's been operating with this kind of computational power for decades, there's been policies and protocols and workflows and procedures and measurement, and all that's been going on for decades around the use of this stuff. So part of me thinks that, should I infer from what you're saying that we can chill out? We don't have to wheel in a bunch of new policies and procedures and blah, blah, blah for the military? And then on the flip side, or the other side of the same coin, can we tell all the people who are freaking out about existential risk related to AI in the military, like accidentally kicking off a chain of reactions from an AI gone wrong, that nuclear weapons are launched around the world and we're all dead? So is that fair to infer from what you've said, that we could calm down because AI is already handled by the military?
I would say it's well handled in places. So it's like calm down in these places and be careful in these other places.
So where's that? Where can we calm down and where should we actually get fired up?
So if you have any sort of deterministic system, right? Anything that is not non-deterministic and high complexity and nonlinear and all of these different things that current convolutional neural nets, machine learning systems are, especially if they're deployed in the real world, in a physical environment where they're interacting in that environment, right? These previous types of systems the military has tried to deploy in those areas. The problem is you just can't write a rules-based system to do that because it's just not going to function. It's not going to work. DARPA tried for 10 years, right? The autonomous land vehicle and the self-driving challenge in like the early 90s didn't work out well.
I take it that's a function of the context having so many variables.
Right. There's so many variables. There's so many different situations. There can't be this kind of hierarchical lexical ordering of these things because it's too massive, right?
It's a mess.
And computational power, right? The world's a complicated mess, but then there's computational power, and then there's the very notion of compute, right? And the hardness of these problems. And when I say hard, and P hard, right? There's that kind of thing, right? But in places where those rules-based, symbolic logic-based systems work and they make sense, and they have been deployed, again, going back to something like ballistic missile defense, right? Like, I don't worry about those types of things, right? It's because they're physics-based models. There are rules. We can figure it out and we can test them. We can test them end to end, right? So we know how to do testing and evaluation and verification on those systems. Cool. Don't worry about it. Chill out, right? However, it also says something on precision-guided munitions. If you're looking at Hellfires and if you're looking at other types of cruise missile technologies, these have the same types of software architecture. Nobody seems to have a problem with that, right? Everybody loves a good precision-guided munition. It's supposed to be more precise, right? It gets to where it's going to go. You can ditch it in flight if you need to. You have communications linked with it, blah, 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 right? All of these things. But when you're starting to then say, I want to add in these non-deterministic, highly complex, nonlinear systems that you can't fully test because of their complexity and because of the fact that, one, there's the model itself, which is so complex, and you can't fully test every potentiality, right? It would take 100 million years, right, to run that program.
Sure.
So you can't do that. So you can figure out different ways to bind the problem space, right? You can create what we, like in air domains, right? We could say we can create Guardian style systems. So this is like geofencing and sense and avoid and ground collision and that kind of stuff, right? You can figure out ways in which you can put a binding box, a boundary box around the system so it's okay in that respect. But within that boundary, you don't really know so much. But those are all like risk acceptance arguments, right? Like, what are the risks? And then what are the rewards? And then what am I willing to do? That has little to do with the technology and everything to do with policy and politics and societal concern, right?
Well, if I try to boil down what you're saying, tell me if this is wrong, but it sounds like testing things in controlled scenarios, no problem. Been doing it for years. Testing things in uncontrolled, unpredictable scenarios, really hard. Could be highly risky. That's always been the case. Nothing new with AI there.
Yeah. So testing autonomous systems, for instance, autonomous systems that rely on deep learning or machine learning and things like this. That's a different set of testing challenges. There's T and E and V challenges that are fundamentally different.
What are those acronyms?
T and E and V. So testing and evaluation, verification, and validation. So that's the software validation, that's or verification, that's the validation to system behavior, to requirements, right? You said that you write a set of requirements, you validate those requirements, right? Even writing requirements for autonomous systems, that the behavior is such that like you can't even really write requirements in the normal way. But the DoD's had an autonomy community of interest for a long time with highly capable people that
Sure.
understand these challenges and they know where the pain points are. And so what I can say is everybody needs to chill out on whether or not the DoD is going to rapidly field a technology that it doesn't fully understand and can
Right.
potentially be highly dangerous, not just to other people, but to their own people.
Sure.
And so
Sure.
in that respect, is it a worry? Sure. Is it an immediate worry? Probably not so much, right? And in that respect, I'm always horizon scan the risk. Don't discount the risk, but don't
Sure.
feel like it's a knee-jerk reaction, right? It's not,
Yeah.
oh my God, we're all going to die.
Yeah. So I feel like people talk about the military and internal design of AI or procurement or something like that as though it were, I don't know, like your average Fortune 500, non-tech Fortune 500 company where someone's going to sell HR technology to it and the HR people are not going to have any knowledge or processes by which they could vet their HR, their AI for
That's
char
definitely
for bias or
happening.
something like that. 100%. But the military is not like that, right? Like the military, I take it, at least in principle, it doesn't just take things off the shelf and start using them without performing some phenomenally deep due diligence. Or if they're going to build it internally, they're going to have to do all the internal due diligence on whatever they built internally. And they've got to have, since they've been doing this kind of thing, the policies in some sense already exist. To your point, like you've got to plug in, or they've got to plug in particular things in their procedures that they didn't, which is to say, whereas the procedure or the process is roughly test it, they need to come up with new tests in order
Right.
to test the new kind of technology.
Right.
But the sort of the structure of the process is the same. It's this is when we test it.
Yeah.
This is who tests it. This is
Right.
how we test it. Or maybe not the how test, but
Oh.
this is who tests it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not the how, but all the rest is already there. Go to these, what is it, the Institute for Future of Humanity or something, and they've got this video. These are the people who started that letter about the pause, the 6-month pause.
Oh, this is the Slaughterbot video.
What's that?
What is it? Are you talking about the video where it's like all the little drones come in and they like try to find the person and assassinate them, and it's the killer robot
No,
stuff?
this is
Oh.
No, this is the stuff where it's like AI being used in like a nuclear facility and it makes a mistake
Oh.
and so everybody launches their warheads.
Oh, it might
It's
be.
like
Yeah, it might be a new thing, a new video. Yeah. So it sounds like the Future of Life Institute, I think, is what you're.
Yeah.
Disclosure: I took money from them. Full disclosure: they funded some of my research back in the day. Or I should say, Elon Musk gave them a grant that funded my research. But anyway,
But that
yeah.
just stuff seems to me like it's in principle possible. It's not like it's a literal impossibility. It's
Right.
just that I think it would seem to me, I would think, a massive lapse in what standard protocol is for vetting the technology in a nuclear context.
Okay, just to be clear, because I like me some specifics, right? On the conventional side, right? There's three things to think about, right? For your listeners and for you, right? There are weapons, and then within the weapons thing, right? There are conventional weapons and nuclear weapons, right? And those two
Mhm.
things have very different sorts of processes and procedures going on. So those are two of your things, right?
Yep.
So when you're thinking about the things that go boom, and then there's the things that don't go boom, right? And so the things that don't go boom is everything from business processes to command and control networks to data lakes
Mhm.
and everything that the CIO will be in charge of. And then just generally, all sorts of boring things, right? Logistics, which are important but boring. So that side of the house is like one side where AI applications can actually have like COTS, so commercial off-the-shelf technologies, where the DoD will actually take that. Then they can have GOTS, so government off the shelf, where they can have a commercial thing, but it's tailored to government. So you can think of this as like the DoD wants access to a cloud, right? But what it needs is like a secure cloud, right? Because it needs things for classification levels. So that would be like a government off the shelf kind of thing. We're going to use Azure or we're going to use whatever for government, right? And then there's like specific in-house technology that's grown either in-house completely or within the defense industrial base, right? So this is your Lockheeds, these are your Andurils, this is your Raytheons, right? Like all that stuff. And so they build a system, and then they build a system based on a capability and a need. And then throughout that acquisition process, there's all these different milestones of testing that the developer is doing and the integrator, if there is one, is going to be doing. And then the government at some point is going to step in and do its own testing before it says, yes, I take this on and I take all of the liability and all that other stuff. Right? So that's like one side. So the weapons testing side, that testing side, where all these milestones are. So there's the operational, developmental, live fire, all of these types of testing regimes for weapons. There's the conventional side of weapons, and then there's the nuclear side. And the nuclear side, one, we have all these different challenges around testing for good reason. of testing nuclear weapons because we don't want to like mess the planet up any more than we have. But then on the other side of that are nuclear command and control processes, right? And that is very different than saying, like, where am I going to inject AI into the nuclear command and control process or chain? And so that, I think, if you're going to put AI anywhere, it already is there, right? Like, that's the first thing. It's already there, right? What do you think the sensor networks are doing for all the different sensors everywhere? And if it's saying, like, oh, we've got ballistic missiles flying or nuclear weapons flying in at us, why do you think we know that? Is it because we have like a string of people lined up from here to Russia over land? No, it's because we have satellites and we have sensors and all that stuff. And then the processing of that information and all the other stuff, right? And we require dual authentication on all of these different types of things to say it is or it is not, in fact, a thing. So that's one side of it. But that's our processes and procedures. And given the fact that it's a very unstable situation where you have launch on warning or you have like just automated stuff. Russia, for instance, in the Soviet Union and Russia have said, oh, we're going to have just dead hand systems where we sense something's happening. We think you're going to launch, which is even crazier, right? That's a preemptive, right? So we think you're going to launch, and so we're going to launch before you launch. That's super dangerous. And then if they think that we've launched and they go ahead and just flip it to right dead hand in case everybody's dead, the missiles will still launch. That's very worrisome. It doesn't require AI. It's never required AI, right? It might require the symbolic logic style AI but it doesn't really even require that, right? Like it could pretty much be like a seismic sensor. And then if that seismic sensor goes off, launch the nuke. So there's different ways in which the nuclear command and control thing can be interrupted or abused in the processes. But those are also questions typically for other countries, right? So our command and control, our NC3, right? Nuclear command, control, and communications is such that does it need modernizing? Yes. Does the infrastructure need modernizing? Completely. Is AI going to be in that modernization? Maybe. But is it going to be on a warhead? No. Right? I think that's the end all be all is like, no one in the DoD is saying, let's put machine learning and the decision to launch in the hands of a system like this, right? That's not true.
Maybe this is a bit too coarse-grained a distinction, but I want to, based on what you said, just distinguish between something like tools on the one hand and processes on the other. Something like that, like tools versus operations.
Got it.
Where the tools here are, of course, weapons, and there's different categories of weapons. There's like nuclear versus conventional. Fine, okay, but they all fall in the category of tools, and you got operations on the other side.
Everything's a tool if you're not a person.
Sure, that's fine, yeah.
And even in some instances, the military might call them tools. Go on.
So a subset of all tools are weapons, obviously.
Right. Yeah.
But there's non-weapon tools. Anyway, so we've got tools versus operations. It sounds like we've got some degree of AI in both categories. Is that fair?
Yes.
And relatedly, there exist various processes for overseeing the integration of new technologies into either processes or tools.
Yes.
And so we don't have to, I think, can I walk away with this? We don't have to throw ourselves into a panic as though we have a foreign technology, a foreign thing has suddenly landed on our shores and the military might do all sorts of crazy shit with it. They could, in principle, of course, but we have things in place.
Yes.
And so if the military continues to do the kind of diligence that it's been doing for the past decades, if it doesn't suddenly decide to be reckless, then, again, the probability of something happening of an existential variety is probably not particularly probable and probably less probable than other kinds of scenarios where humanity is wiped out.
Yes. And I think what would have to happen is a fundamental change in lots of processes within the DoD.
There's no reason to think that would happen. Is there any reason for thinking that there's going to be fundamental changes in how the military or whether the military engages in due diligence?
The only thing I think that would challenge the speed of change, which would then change the processes, is pacing with an adversary. So that would be like the China threat, right? So where they say we're following too far behind and we have to field technologies faster than we had in the past, which is a drumbeat that the folks in Washington are beating that drum, right? We need to, they call it innovate at the speed of relevance, right? That's their phrase. And
I mean, this is arms race stuff. It's an arms race. It's just it's
not technically
quite, no,
not. arms race has a very particular dynamic, and it's not really, it's a competition. It's not an arms race. And so within that competition, though, right, the competition hasn't turned into a race dynamic to where you're just saying, forget it, right? Like, I'm risk acceptant. And so right now we need to pace that competition. We don't need to throw out all the rules, right? If the United States were at war, physically, really like World War II style, 60 million people dead style war, then yeah, I think what you're going to see is what you're seeing in Ukraine, right? It's the same kind of thing, right? If you have to cobble together whatever you can to fight for your life, you will. But if we're not in that position, then no. What you're going to do is you're going to say, we're going to innovate. We're going to try to create the best things we can with the most safeties that we have. Because the military, I've worked around these folks for a long time, with and amongst them, and they want the coolest tech, but they want it to work, right? They don't want it to blow up in their face. So, literally. So there's a bit of prudential self-servingness to that. But that's so, to me, I'm like, look, prudence isn't necessarily a morally bad thing. And they are concerned with knock-on effects, and they are concerned with secondary and tertiary effects, and they are concerned with the dispersion of different technologies and weapons all over the world, and they don't have the monopoly on them. And then how do you counter that, right? I would just say that everybody needs to take a bit of a chill pill. But I also think, and DOD included, like, y'all need to take a bit of a chill pill too, right? Instead of, oh, China's got robot dogs with machine guns on them. And I'm like, yeah, no kidding. Boston Dynamics created the flipping robot dog. That came from us. Where do you think the Chinese got it? Us. But on the same time, everybody needs to take a chill pill. And then everybody also needs to say, what are we good at? What can we do? What can we do well, fast, and appropriately? And then where are the risks that we're going to say, you know what, we're going to invest in these areas and we're going to go really hard and fast in them, but we're not putting weapons on them and deploying them. We're learning from them. And I think to the most of that is exactly what DOD is doing, is saying, I want to learn from this stuff. I need to know, which is why they have in the National Defense Authorization Acts, the NDAAs, they have explicitly said they want more prototypes and demos, because guess what you do with prototypes and demos? You learn.
Okay, so we can be a little bit less worked up about absent cause for panic or something like that, which is like absent, say, phenomenal aggression from a foreign adversary.
Right.
We can chill out. So then the concern is, I guess one concern would be something like, let's suppose that the U.S. military engages in a level of due diligence of a sort that makes us more or less comfortable, or at least as comfortable as one could reasonably be, in given what's at stake and given the power of the technology. Okay, so we're cool with that, but then we have to wonder whether other countries will be similarly diligent with the integration of AI into their tools and operations.
Historically, they're not.
Okay, so say more about that. A number of countries have nuclear weaponry right now. So I'm just give you a line of thought that comes from, I don't know, maybe it's naive. It's me putting on a hat. Look, I know this is not your position, but I say to some imagined other, look, you're all worked up about foreign countries integrating AI in this irresponsible way, and everything's going to get blown up. But look, nuclear weaponry was invented a while ago, at least, but a decent amount of time. Other countries have developed it. They have those weapons. And while, of course, one day we could blow ourselves up in principle, so far so good. There's been some scares.
Quite a few, but yeah.
So yes, there's a sort of, I don't know, an additional source of catastrophe, but I'm not sure how much the probabilities have changed from pre-AI integration to AI integration for a mass extinction event.
Yeah, for a mass extinction event, I'm not super certain that the risk of AI nukes go rogue is where I would focus my attention, right? I have a leaderboard. That one is not number one on. And yeah, that one, y'all just need to simmer down.
So what's on your leaderboard? What's number one? Or top three?
My top three existential risk.
Maybe. I don't know. Yeah. So first of all, one question is, are any of them in a military context?
No.
Interesting. Okay. So what's the non-military context that worries you when it comes to something like integration of AI or use of AI or something like that?
I think global warming and massive
Okay, yeah.
climate change and like huge displacement of peoples that cause
Yes.
massive political unrest, which then cause massive backlash against immigrants and displaced persons. And then you get military
Yeah.
stuff involved. But the causal factor is not
Yeah.
really military, right?
So I keep asking about the
Right.
probability of catastrophe compared to other kinds of things. Climate change obviously being an easy
Yeah.
candidate.
I feel like if you had to say like the causal arrow, which obviously in these types of instances, you can never fully understand the causality. But if you could, if you under a hood examine it and say, what's the causal arrow here? And is the military the causal arrow? I would say no.
Yeah.
I would say it's politics before it's military. It's climate before it's military, right? It's probably an asteroid before it's a military.
Mm. Yeah.
Those are
Yeah.
kinds
Yeah.
of the things that I would say in terms of straight, weirdly causal arrows. And politics and climate change to me are the ones that are going to be the causal arrows.
Sure. Yeah.
So now for other countries, you asked for specifics, right? Like I would say that the nuclear weapon states currently, for the most part, none of them want to engage in a nuclear war, right? Because no one wins, right? Like we figured
Sure.
this out a long time ago, right? Nuclear winter, not a good
Exactly.
thing.
Yeah.
The whole planet dies. We don't want to do that. To threaten nuclear attacks or tactical nuclear use or things like this, or low grade, whatever, that increases the likelihood of accident, which is not great. But an accident, I think you could say it's one thing that was launched and we can walk back from it. And it's not like
Hmm.
all of thousands and thousands of warheads are launched. But I would say that in the US case and the European cases, I don't think that you have such a risk, right? Their processes are just different. Their cultures are just different around this. Hard to say on China, I would say. Hard to say. I can't see them actually wanting to saber rattle in such a way that it risks it, right? Now, do they want to modernize and do they want more of them? Sure. But does that mean they're going to want to use them? Probably not. When they first acquired nuclear technology, they acquired the technology, but they also didn't require any delivery systems. So nobody was worried about it. It's cool, you have a bomb, but you can't do anything with it. Awesome. But Russia, on the other hand, right, historically, Russia has been very fast to field technologies that are really crappy, shitty engineering jobs, right? And they end up killing a lot
Mm.
of their own people and killing a lot of other people. And Russia's okay with that, right? And this is not just like under Putin, right? This is for a long time to neo-Soviet Putinism, right? I feel like what you have is just a devaluation on people's lives, right? And so whatever the source of power is, be it the CCP or be it Putin, what they do is they say, I don't care, throw some people at it, take it out there and test it and see what happens. And so in that respect, their testing is very different than the US testing, than the Western way of testing, where they have a much higher threshold where they don't want to use people as guinea pigs. Chemical weapons aside. Let's just say chemical was on the table. But
Yeah.
for the most part, the West doesn't want to do that. There's just a different tolerance around that. And Russia has had just historically bad engineering around various things for a number of years and had
Yeah.
a lot of accidents, a lot of accidents.
So we've been talking this whole time about AI in general. It feels like everything that we're saying or that you're saying is inclusive of generative AI, which of course everyone's all psyched about right now. Are there any exceptions or are there any particular things that you think generative AI, any risks that generative AI brings to, say, a military context that we didn't have before?
Yeah,
And
stupidity.
yeah, go on.
If I'm being honest, right? And there's
Yeah.
the one thing of saying, okay, look, we've got processes and we've got testing and there's testing and evaluation, all that stuff. That's all like one side of making a distinction of what kind of AI are you talking about. And so I get agitated when people say AI in a blanket term and they mean something
Mhm.
or they don't realize that it covers a host of things, right? So that's
Yeah,
one of
sure.
my sources of frustration.
Yeah.
However, when people are saying like, oh no, I'm going to be really specific with you, Roth, and I'm going to say this kind of AI, and I'm really worried about the US military or other militaries using that kind of AI.
Yeah.
Generative AI being one of them, right? And so
Yeah.
I think when it comes to generative AI, I think people put way too much credence on the capability of the system because it's like, wow, look at it can do this. It's like a trick pony, right? Look what it can do.
Sure.
And you go, yeah,
Yeah.
sure, it can do that a lot and it can do some really cool things. But do I want to bet my life for 30 people's lives or 150 people or 2,000 people on an aircraft carrier? Do I want to risk their lives, right? Or a
Sure.
couple of million people in a city? Do I want to risk their lives? And so in that respect, no, right? However, I would say that's in like the war, armed conflict, things that go boom context.
Okay.
In the non-things that go boom context, I do think that there are risks associated with using generative AI for the armed forces, and they have to be careful and calculated about how they use it for those back office, quote unquote, back office type activities, because people get lazy, right? And so you start to undervalue competency in humans. And then you say, I can just get an AI to do that. And so I don't need to train these people. I don't need to value those people. I don't need to double check the work of the machine. And you get into this AI, this automation bias stuff. And so I think that's where the risks come in, right? Is when you're forcing this technology on the population to use because you think you're going to save time or you're going to save money or you're going to save both. And in reality, you're creating potentially a bigger morass of crap that you're going to have to wade through than if you didn't do that in the first place. If you just said, hey, stand by, let's see how the commercial industry figures this out before we in the national security community decide to put it into practice.
I guess what I'm thinking of in this context is something like, let's take non-military, take a healthcare case. So a lot of people think about AI in healthcare. They'll think about things like using large language models to diagnose patients. But of course, there's also back office use cases like filing insurance claims or getting authorization for an insurance claim or pre-authorization for an insurance claim so that they can treat patients, yada, yada. And that sort of feels like, oh, it's just back office, whatever. But no, people getting denied coverage, or there's lives at risk. And so I take that what you're pointing to is an analog to that, but in a military context. So yeah, we would talk about AI in the military, we might think about things that go boom, but then there's all this back office stuff that's analogous to the getting pre-authorization for insurance for covering a surgery or something.
Yeah, and I
things
think
can go sideways there as well. In a way that hurts people.
And I think, Reed, as a philosopher and as an analytic philosopher, you'll appreciate. I like it when I have my nice little analytic categories so that I can make little buckets of things. And I tend to think of it as, look, does this piece of technology impact, if that's your favorite word, I hate that word, but impact or affect the rights, the lives, or the opportunities of individuals? If it doesn't, then it's a pretty low, have at it. But if you're saying like, this affects my ability to get housing under free housing.
That's exactly how I think about it. Yeah.
This affects my ability, right.
Does it affect anyone's ability to access the basic goods of life? That is to say, the kinds of things that they need in life to lead a minimally decent life. If yes, holy shit, let's take a close look. If not, who cares?
And there's obviously, there's a spectrum here of what minimally decent life looks like, right? And for who,
yes,
and
of course.
what, there's argumentation about that.
Yeah.
But it's, if you are being denied basic things that you're entitled to, if there's a quote unquote entitlement associated with the thing, or that you are guaranteed a right to somewhere in some legal legislation, then you better be really careful about using that generative AI in that context, because that is slippery. 95% of the time, it might be working fine, but 5% of the time it might not. And if the scale of application is such that 5% is actually like 400 million people, that's bad, right?
Yeah. Can you give me an example? So that's analogous to the checking for insurance authorization for a procedure. Like, what would be the military analog of that? The back office stuff that would lead to ethically bad stuff, people dying, lots of people getting hurt, something like that.
Well, yeah, I wrote about this a few weeks ago. So this was, initially it wasn't an AI thing. It was actually just straight up econometrics, right? Just straight up stat. But somebody said, hey, let's sprinkle a little AI on it because why not? And this was the VA, a healthcare program for identifying the most at-risk vets in the VA who would be at risk for suicide. And the way in which that entire research methodology was created completely ignored a major source of trauma, which is a major indicator or a major causal arrow, if you will, of potentially being suicide, why you would want to go down that road. And that was sexual trauma. And so it completely ignored all of this stuff. And it overrepresented data in all these really weird ways it was very heavily biased towards white men. It was very heavily biased mostly towards senior enlisted or officers. And so when you're looking at that and you're like, okay, you've completely missed the boat here. You're not even capturing the data of those most at-risk people. And the crazy part is that the VA has that data. It's not that they don't actually get it. They do. They ask those questions from everybody who walks through the doors of the VA hospital. This particular program just didn't incorporate that data. It was lazy. And so in that respect, you go, what the hell? So if you're saying like, you're not even checking to see if women are suffering from some sort of mental health issue due to sexual trauma, which by the way, if we look around at the stats around sexual trauma in the military, not that great. And it can go both ways, right? Men can suffer from sexual assault and sexual trauma too. But come on, guys, right? That affects a ton of people because the intervention for that they think of it's a benefit, right? It's a benefit for those individuals who get it. They get more attention, they get greater resources, they get all this help. And what you're saying is those people that I don't want to include into this don't get that benefit. And you're like, well, why not? Because they're a woman, right? Because what is it that's going on here? So some sort of screwed up research methodology at one point in time has affected the potential benefits of a whole host of people. And now it's got AI in it. Great, wonderful. So that's like one example of something that goes really poorly. And then you have other examples of models and predictive analytics based on AI, where you go, what's the counterfactual of that, right? So if you're predicting outcome A and you're just ignoring all of these things that are happening and only looking at this outcome A, what does that do for everybody? And that goes from everything from whether or not you should get maybe some extra mentorship or coaching or leadership positions to whether or not you're getting your VA benefits, to whether or not your VA claims are getting processed correctly. Because we all know in the DoD military community, right? Like the VA is under an immense amount of strain financially as well as for all sorts of other reasons. And wouldn't it be great if we could make those processes easier? Totally. But if you end up screwing up the process even worse and all of these claims are being denied, for instance, then that's really bad too. Or if you get housing vouchers, right? Section 8 housing, or if you have all of these other crappy facial recognition that ends up misidentifying you and you become arrested, right? There was a case in Texas not too long ago where a gentleman was arrested under this really suspicious application of facial recognition. And it wasn't him. It was easily, like, all you had to do was look at his travel. He wasn't even in the state at the time. He was arrested, thrown into jail like on a Friday. And over the weekend, while he was waiting to be arraigned on Monday to say, I wasn't even here, he was sexually assaulted in jail. Now he's suing the city and the institute and the company that did this. But you go, those are real life implications of people are using this technology that are affecting not just like the basic necessities and like the minimum, whatever you want to call it for life, but rights, privileges, benefits, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. All right. This is all super helpful, super interesting. One last question that's a bit lighter. I love when someone says something like, I hate the word impact. Tell me why you hate the word impact.
Number one, so when I was in graduate school, you'll love this. When I was in graduate school, I think I used the word impact. My PhD advisor, side note, like my dad, right? He, over the years, we're still in communication and he's a friend of mine. But I remember sitting in his office and he said, I don't understand this word, what you use it, Heather. He goes, all I have in my head is the vision of two beach balls colliding together. And so ever since then, I can't help but have that picture in my head. And then I start to think about it because I hear it everywhere. Everybody talks about impact. And then I think about like crashing cars and impact. And I'm like, well, do you want to crash into stuff? That's not a good thing, right? We have impact.
Yeah. Sure.
And also in academia, if anybody is listening as an academic, we have this whole thing of you need to be able to talk about or measure your impact and give them impact statement about your work.
Yeah.
And you're like, well, what the hell is that? And like, how do you do that?
Yeah.
And so I feel like it's just a really bad word, another bad word that's overused and abused. And we have so many of these words that are abused and I hate them, right? I don't like impact. I hate the word trust for autonomous systems and AI. I think
yes. Yeah.
that one needs to die a very quick death and not a slow death.
on.
So yeah.
Well, okay, I'm with you. I don't like the word impact either, but I think it's for different reasons. We can talk about it in a second. But why do you hate trust? I've gone on a small rant about people using the word trust, but I want to hear your rant.
Because it's a word that covers a myriad of sins. It is just this big umbrella term that it's like a suitcase term. It just smuggles in all of this stuff. And then when you press on it, it completely is vacuous. And they're like, well, no, this. And I'm like, so you mean reliability? Oh, well,
exactly.
not necessarily just reliability. Well, justifying confidence. And you're like, well, what the fuck is justified confidence? How are you justifying it? What's the math behind that? Is there a test? There's so many things.
You just don't get it, Heather. It just all comes down to trust. It all comes down to trust.
And then
it's worse than the phrase. It all comes down to trust. What the hell?
What does that mean?
Useless. It means all the things are good. All the things.
So Dave Inks and I wrote this paper years ago called Trust But Verify, right? And we talked about thick levels of trust and thin levels of trust where it was like mere reliability. At least we tried a little bit to actually define these that have differences. But it's when you're referring it to an interpersonal type of thing, a characteristic of something or a property of something, it's relational.
Sure.
There's two agents involved. There's so many things that don't involve things and people.
I know. It's very annoying because it's impossible to have a conversation when someone just says, at the end of the day, it's all about trust. That's not action guiding. That's just a label that you slap on
a bumper sticker.
The scenario in which everything has gone well. Nothing has gone poorly.
That is bumper sticker lifestyle.
Totally. And corporate branding.
Corporate branding, bumper stickers, and also like founders who just want to say what they want when they think they're being really deep and meaningful, and they're like, go fast or whatever. It's all about trust. And you're just like,
I'll just tell you, we'll end our mutual rant in a second. I'll just say that I don't like people talking about impact because they're always talking about how they want to have an impact. And I always think, I just want to have an impact. And I think there's something
narcissistic.
I don't know. There's two things about it that are in tension. One is that it's objectionably narcissistic.
Yeah.
They don't just want like a thing to happen. They want to be the ones to do it.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's also to regard themselves as a mere tool.
Wow.
I don't care I am a tool for bringing about good consequences. I just want to bring about impact. That's a bizarre way to view yourself and your life as a tool for bringing about good things. I want to do things that I find intrinsically interesting or intrinsically worthwhile. And presumably, hopefully, those things will also have a good impact. But I don't do it for the sake of the impact because the doing of it is what is engaging. So to focus one's life and attention on impact, it's just, I don't know. It's regarding oneself as a tool.
Not living a life worth living. It's very...
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Forget it. Anyway, so that's why I hate the term. It drives me nuts. Don't live your life around impact. But this is also by the tech people, the ones who see themselves as our saviors. I'm here to have an impact, to make as Silicon Valley sent up many times, to make the world a better place.
That's AI for the benefit of humanity. And I'm like, benefit of humanity, who's included in that? Also, when you talk about, I love this impact thing about you being used as a tool, right? Because that's exactly how the tech industry thinks of it, right? The crazy people in tech, right? The crazy founders who I will not name names, right? But the ones who think that humans are
happen to indirectly fund your research?
That indirectly fund my research, that also happen to think that humanity is needed, biology, quote unquote, biology is needed to get to silicon, and silicon is going to get us to a position for the super intelligence, which can then populate other planets, because what we really need to do is save consciousness and not humanity. I am not making that crap up. Look it up, publicly stated by crazy people.
I don't know if I can look it up. I've seen intimations of such things. They're too.
I'll send you the talk. I'll send you the link.
Okay, send me the link. I'll try to stomach it. I'll do the best that I can. All right, Heather, thank you so much. It's been great learning about AI in the military, and especially the rants at the end.
Oh yes, mutual anytime. Rants. Yeah, mutual rants.
Great.
Yeah. I don't know. Anyway, if anybody needs a good rant or a little bit of snark, they know where to find me.
Sounds great. All right, thanks so much.
Thanks. Have a good one.
Thanks so much, everyone, for listening. And now let me thank the people who have made this podcast possible. So first of all, we have Delano Alexander. He's been with me since day one. He showed me even how to start recording a podcast in the first place. He does editing stuff. He's been fantastic, and he does really everything I ask him to and more. I've never met anyone else who just says so much. Yeah, I don't know how to do that, but I'll figure it out. What more could you ask for in a producer? Next up, Jennifer Strong, my podcast guru. I don't know what else to call her. She just has advised me on how to design the podcast, how to grow it, and she's responsible for, if you like, this kind of season 2 relaunch and everything around it. So thank you to you, Jennifer. Next up, Meg Marco, responsible for all the excellent artwork. Before I did the artwork, I didn't really know what I was doing. We put it together. It worked well enough, but I think Meg really did a phenomenal job bringing everything together. Garrett Lang, sound engineer that I frankly don't deserve. He's just too good for this podcast. Don't tell him I said that, though. Next up, Benjamin Koltgen. He is a professor of philosophy who has helped me source guests, identify who's interesting, who has things to say, etc., etc. So without him, I wouldn't have anyone to talk to. And then finally, Ashley Wasylenko, who helps with all manner of administrative things, making sure that the podcast guests find their way to the podcast, can schedule the recording, get their bios and headshots, and really just keeping the show on the rails and me organized. Thanks to all of you. Really appreciate all your hard work.